Hey everybody. Well, this is a little strange, isn't it? Feels like we're back at COVID, recording online and teaching online, but I am a little bit sick. Hopefully I'll be back tomorrow or Friday, but I wanted to make sure that we were able to finish our content before spring break, and so since we don't have a whole lot left to do, I decided to just create this PowerPoint with you guys where I'll go through the remaining slides and walk you through the rest of the slides that we have. Okay, so I'm going to draw on this. I'll be able to hopefully explain everything just as good as I would in person. Do excuse me if you hear some coughs. I will try and minimize that. But yeah, let's get going. So we ended at herbivory. I don't think we did that. Our last slide was predation here, where we spoke about predator-prey relationships. So let's just move on to our next relationship called herbivory. And herbivory is very simple. It is, of course, going to be a plus-minus relationship where one organism is going to be positively impacted while another organism is going to be negatively impacted. And this one's simple because it's just organisms that eat plants, right? And so the organism that's eating the plant is going to benefit from this relationship, while the organism that is being eaten, so the plant, is going to be negatively impacted. Okay? And that's it for herbivory. Pretty straightforward. Okay? All right. So, symbiosis. So, symbiosis is a relationship with two organisms or more that live in direct contact with one another, right? So, they are going to be directly connected with one another, and they're going to interact with each other very, very intimately. Now, under the category of symbiosis, we have three different relationships. The first we have is called parasitism, and parasitism is a plus-minus relationship. One organism, the parasite, is going to derive nourishment from another. So these are literally your parasites that you can find throughout our ecosystems, where organisms will take nutrients. They are going to maybe suck blood from an organism. They're going to live off of that organism, right? And so parasites can be anything like maggots, right? You have different types of worms. You could even have, certain bacteria also can be parasitic. But the idea is that these organisms are going to literally take nutrients away from another organism, harming that organism. But it itself is going to be, going to have a successful life because it's getting nutrients for free. Okay. Your second type of symbiotic relationship is called mutualism, right? And mutualism is a plus relationship. And this is where both organisms benefit from one another, which makes sense. Mutual, right? If this is a mutual relationship, right? Mutual, that means that both of us are happy with that relationship. And so mutualistic, both organisms are going to benefit. So a good example of mutualism might be, tiny fish and sharks. If you've ever seen a video where there's a big fish, a big shark swimming around, and then there are little tiny fish that follow it, that could be a mutualistic relationship. The tiny fish are going to eat, little bacteria and little parasites that live on the shark, and the shark benefits because they're getting cleaned. So both of these organisms are benefiting. The last one is called commensalism, and commensalism is a +0 relationship. So this is where one organism benefits, and I know we haven't seen 0 yet, guys, but we're looking at it now. 0 means that they don't benefit or get harmed. So there's no plus or minus. It's kind of just, there's nothing happening to it. The organism is getting nothing from this relationship, good or bad. And commensalism works that way because for this reason exactly, one organism will get something, but the organism number two doesn't really care about the other guy. Whatever it's doing is not impacting their life. And these three images down here are ones that are able to, express each of these. Commensalism mainly is going to be this guy right here, our center image of this cattle with these birds. So the reason this is commensalism is because these birds, right, over time have evolved to understand that the cattle is very heavy. And as it's walking in the field, what it's doing is it picks up dirt, right? It's really heavy. It's a large animal. And so it kicks up dirt and it breaks up the soil. And because it's doing that, worms and bugs and insects in the soil are going to come to the surface. And so what these birds have learned to do over their lifespan is sit on these cattle's heads and their backs, and they essentially just ride around with them. And when the cattle kicks up dirt and insects and bugs, the birds can hop off, go eat them, and then hop back onto his head and just keep going for a ride. And the cattle don't care, right? They have zero interest in the birds. They don't mind them being there. And so this is commensalistic because the cattle gain nothing from this. They're going to keep doing their thing no matter what. But the birds are getting quick, easy, free food sources with minimal energy. All right, symbiosis. Okay. Our last one is called facilitation. So facilitation can either be positive, where both are going to be impacted positively, or like we saw before, zero positive, one doesn't really care, not bad or good. This is when one species has a positive effect on the survival and reproduction of another, but there isn't really intimate association. And so in some instances, it's going to benefit both, but in others, it's not going to benefit one of them because they don't really interact much. This is common in plants where some plants help others reproduce. They help spread pollen. It's not super common, but it is one that can exist in nature. All right, so pretty quick with that as well. Alrighty, so let's talk about species diversity now. So we're done talking about some of our relationships. Let's talk about biodiversity. So species diversity, also known as biodiversity, guys, a very, very important term. Biodiversity sounds exactly like what it is, the variety of organisms in a community. Bio for biology, diversity, many. So many different species within a community. Now, there are two different categories of biodiversity. The first is called species richness, which is the number of different species in an environment. How rich is the environment? How many different species are present? And then there's also something called relative abundance. And abundance is the proportion of each species. Okay? It's the proportion of each. So these are two different ways of calculating biodiversity. They are distinct, okay? And it may be a little confusing as to what the difference is, but we're going to look at a practice problem on the next slide, which I think will make it a little bit more clear, okay? And just take note again, guys, that biodiversity, right? This is a very, very important note. Biodiversity boosts ecosystem productivity. The greater the biodiversity, the more resilient it is, okay? And when we talk about resilience, we mean that biodiversity is going to increase the chances of survival. It's going to increase the chances of success. It's going to increase the likelihood that organisms will live, that they won't be able to get killed. It's going to make the ecosystem strong. Okay, very, very important that you understand that. It is a direct correlation, everybody. Increases in biodiversity increase ecosystem resilience. Decreases in biodiversity decrease ecosystem resilience. Right? Very important. So let's take a look at the difference. Sorry, guys, needed a sip of OJ. Let's take a look at richness versus abundance so that we could see the difference. Okay? So here's the whole practice problem. I'm just going to show it at once, but let's walk through it. Let's examine 2 tree communities below. Each of the communities has 100 individuals, but they are distributed among 5 tree species, A, B, C, D, and E. These are each species of tree, okay? So when we look at community 1, what we see is that we have 20 A species. We have 20 B species, 20 C species, 20 D species, 20 E species. In community 2, we have only 5 A species, 25 B, 15 C, 20 D, 35 E. And so what can we conclude about this? Well, what we're able to conclude is both communities have the same richness, right? Because if we look back on our slide here, richness is the number of different species. How many different species? Well, if we look at both of our communities, both of them have 5 species. They both have species A, B, C, D, and E. A, B, C, D, E. 5 species. But they have different abundances of those species. Community 1 has 20 A's, while community 2 only has 5. And so do we now see the difference between richness and abundance? You could have communities that are equally rich in species. They have the same number of them. But one species could have more diversity in their abundances, how many of each of them. And so I'm going to just pose a question to you real quick and ask you this question. Do you think community 1 or community 2 is better suited for survival? Which is going to be better at surviving and thriving? Right? And I'm not going to give you that answer right now, but I want you to just keep an answer in your mind and maybe think about which one do you think would be best suited for survival based on the info here. Excuse me. We'll come back to that, okay? All right. Let's talk a little bit more about species diversity. So as we said, high diverse species are more resistant to and more resilient, right? They're able to survive better. And one of those reasons is because they are resistant to something called invasive species. So invasive species, as they sound, right, as the definition would suggest, are organisms that become established outside of their native ecosystem, right? Organisms that are found in an area that they should not be in, right? They are not native species, they are invasive, they have invaded. And typically that is done because of humans. Like we've mentioned a few times, we are not great for the environment, right? We do a lot of harm. This is one of the things that we do, is bring in these invasive species. So an example of that is a ship, right? Cargo ships that come from other countries oftentimes are going to have insects or bugs or different types of coral, different types of sea creatures that have clinged to the bottom of the ship. And they're brought into environments that they're not supposed to be in. And what they do is they can cause harm to the environment. They grow and reproduce quickly. They can kill native species, right? Because the organisms could be predatory and they could end up killing the native species, which is going to decrease biodiversity, right? So, or invasive species are very impactful, negatively impactful to an environment because they shouldn't be there and they're causing a lot of harm to the species. Now, sometimes they won't, right? Sometimes it's minimal. Sometimes there really isn't any noticeable effect. But very frequently, invasive species are going to disrupt an ecosystem pretty significantly. Okay? Alrighty. And so, in the same vein of species diversity and invasive species, when we intentionally, right, because sometimes we'll intentionally bring organisms over, right? Things like animal trade, things like, exotic pet trading, which isn't even legal. People like sneak organisms through securities at airports and ports, or it could be unintentional. What we're going to do is that could potentially allow the species, the invasive species, to exploit a new niche, right? A new job, a new role in the ecosystem. And because they've never been there before, they don't have predators and they don't have competitors. They're organisms that are not native to that environment, and so there's nothing that could kill it, and there's nothing that would compete with it. Okay? It's a problem. All right, let's move on to our next topic of keystone species. So now we have something called keystones. So there are certain organisms in an environment that play a pivotal role more so than other organisms in that community. They are known as keystone species. So keystone species are not usually abundant, right? There isn't going to be a ton of them, but they are always going to be very important organisms because they rely, right? Organisms rely on them. They have very important niches. They do an important job, right, or role, and therefore they are so important that they provide support to the other organisms in that environment. Two good examples of keystone species are coral. Coral is living, by the way. I don't know if you know that. A lot of people think that they're just rocks, but they are alive. They're not rocks. And coral reefs serve as a keystone species because they provide shelter to thousands of organisms. They provide food to thousands of organisms. I mean, if you've ever watched like Finding Nemo, you'll see how important coral is. Or if you've ever like actually watched a documentary on actual coral, very important because they again provide support for every other or a lot of other sea creatures in their area. And coral is getting killed because of bleaching and because of, pollution and changes in water temperature, global warming. We're causing the death of that. But they are keystone. Bees are also keystone species, right? I think I mentioned that briefly when we spoke about the waggle dance that bees do and how they're important. If bees don't pollinate our plants, they're the main pollinators, the plants die. And if plants die, there's no oxygen being produced because the CO2 in our atmosphere isn't being removed. And so it is essential to keep them alive so that the rest of the organisms can survive. These are keystone species, guys. Okay, there are a lot of examples. If you want to look up, you can find others, but these are two really good ones. Okay? All right. So a little bit more about keystone. Keystone species, producers, essential abiotic and biotic factors all contribute to maintaining the diversity of an ecosystem. So just recognize that everything we're talking about here, guys, keeps an ecosystem diverse. And when you remove any of them, you're going to see an impact, right? There's going to be problems. But just recognize that specifically keystone species, if they were removed, it would be a ripple effect, right? Often ecosystems would collapse. They are on par with your producers when we spoke about our food chain, where you have producers, you have primary producers, you have primary consumers, tertiary consumers, right? If you remove this guy, then everything happening down here is also going to die. Very similarly is that going to be with keystone species, where if you take them out of an ecosystem, it's going to ripple and cause issues in every other organism. They're very important. Okay? All right, y'all, let's talk a little bit about disturbances. We're coming up to the end here. So disturbances can also influence diversity and composition, right? How many organisms there are, what type of organisms there are. A disturbance, everyone, is simply defined as an event that changes a community by removing organisms or altering resource availability. So you are going to disturb the ecosystem. I mean, it's a pretty self-explanatory statement, but it can happen in numerous ways, right? You're taking things out of the ecosystem, you're killing organisms, you're removing food sources, you're removing water sources, shelter, you're tearing down trees, right? All of these things are possible disturbances. Now, some of them are going to be natural, right? Although fires can also be due to humans, right? That's not always natural. Very often it's not natural, actually. But human activities are a main issue. So we're going to talk about some of these disturbances and how they impact an ecosystem. Okay. So before we get into the actual disturbances, what I would like to discuss is something briefly called ecological succession. So ecological succession, everyone, is a gradual process by which the species composition changes and develops over time after a disturbance. Okay, so essentially what ecological succession is, and I'm going to just write a very brief statement here, is the recovery process. So when an ecosystem is disturbed, when there is a natural disaster, when something happens that impacts an environment, very frequently the environment will recover. It's going to take time, right? And it depends on the type of disturbance, but it's going to recover. That recovery process, the time it takes from disaster to recovery, is called ecological succession. Okay, there are two types of ecological succession, everyone. The first is called primary succession. Primary succession, primary succession is a series of changes on an entirely new, previously lifeless habitat. So this is a habitat that has either never been colonized, but also recognize, guys, that ecological succession, specifically primary succession, can also occur, and I'm going to put a bullet point here for you, can also occur on an environment that was completely destroyed. And that is including, which is important, the soil. Okay? So, primary succession is changes where either a completely barren, lifeless environment is going to begin to generate life, or it's in an environment that has been completely and utterly destroyed down to the soil, meaning this disaster has completely ripped through this ecosystem and killed everything. A very common way that this happens is via a volcano, right? Volcano. So volcanoes, when they erupt, the lava seeps into the soil and into the ground. And not only is it going to burn down and destroy everything on the surface, but it's going to destroy the soil composition too. Everything underground, all the roots, any organisms living there are going to die. That is a common reason for primary succession. Now, primary succession, right, is going to take a longer time, everybody. This is another point that I'd like you to put here. It takes longer, right? Because you are starting fresh. There's no soil, right? If you take a look at number 1 down here, there's nothing there. So primary succession takes a while because you have to start from scratch. And so it could take sometimes hundreds, if not thousands of years to recover from an event that causes primary succession, okay? But what you see over time, everybody, is that throughout the timeline here, you see gradual growth, right? So you start with nothing at 1, but then there's some shrubs, and then there's some bushes with a little bit of dirt now, right? And then you have more shrubs. Eventually you'll have some flowers, trees, etc. Eventually, you get back to normal, okay? But it does take a while. That's primary. Secondary succession is a series of changes that clears an existing community, but, and here's the key, everybody, leaves the soil intact, right? So in a secondary succession event, the soil was not destroyed. It was a disturbance, it was devastating, but it only killed the stuff and destroyed the stuff on the surface. The soil remained. And so because of that, secondary succession is quicker, right? That says quicker, not quicker, quicker. Because you're already starting with soil, so you have a head start. These are typically going to be things like fires, floods, hurricanes, etc. Right? These are things that will impact the surface, but typically leave the soil intact, and then recovery can begin. Okay? All right, y'all. So let's take a look at our last few slides, which are going to be just a couple of examples of disturbances. Human activity is the strongest disturbance, so please make sure we know that. We've already mentioned it a few times, but just to keep that going, we are the most significant impacting factor in an ecosystem. The main reasons that we are the biggest problem is, there's a whole lot. We're just picking 4 of them. We have habitat loss, invasive species, which we spoke about, over-harvesting, and then global change. And we'll talk about each of these briefly. Okay. So, habitat loss is the single greatest threat to biodiversity, everybody, right? If we're talking about specific examples. We are masters at destroying the environment, and we develop and overdevelop, and we urbanize, and we tear down jungles and forests, and we really do a good job at destroying the homes of natural organisms. We cut down trees. We have cattle that graze and therefore destroy the farmland. Real big problem, okay? We also have invasive species, which I'm not going to talk about again to preserve my voice, but also because we already went in depth with that. That is another significant disturbance, okay? We also now have over-harvesting, where we are harvesting faster than their population can rebound. So what that means is we're taking organisms out of an environment quicker than they're able to reproduce. And this is very commonly seen in overfishing, where you could look at commercial fishing boats that pull in thousands of tons of fish at a time, millions and millions of fish. And yes, there are a lot of fish in our oceans, but we are certainly fishing at higher rates than should be acceptable, because we are taking a lot more fish than can be generated, right? It's not gonna end well. I don't know when, I don't know how, but at this rate, we are going to really mess up the ocean's ecosystems, okay? Also, harvesting of ivory, right? Their tusks in elephants. It's now banned in most places. There are still places that try and do it, but it is illegal to harvest ivory, to harvest their tusks. It provides nothing for anyone, right? It's the same composition as your nails, right? Elephants' tusks are made of keratin, which is the same exact thing your fingernails are made of. There's no reason to do it, because harvesting their tusks will typically kill the elephant, and so it has become illegal to do that. So there is some improvement, right? Yay, right? There are things that are improving, but we still got a long ways to go, okay? Global change. So this can be an entire class on its own. We're not really going to get too into it right now, but recognize that humans are altering our climate, right? Climate change is 100% real. It is happening. Atmospheric chemistry, ecological systems that reduce the capacity of Earth. We have air and water pollution that contributes to acid rain, which is killing our crops and killing organisms. We have CO2 emissions that are skyrocketing, right? They are increasing at tremendous rates. Things like electric cars are trying to help that. Using solar energy is trying to help that, but CO2 emissions are very, very high, which is problematic. And then ocean acidification, which we mentioned before with the corals. It's destroying coral reefs. It is killing organisms in the ocean, really, really negatively impacting our ecosystems. All right, and global climate change, everybody, is almost exclusively because of humans. Right? There is really no other factor that has caused such a significant rise in such a little amount of time. We are the source of that. Okay? And so human disturbances have led to a significant increase in the number of endangered species, right? We are causing species to die. We are causing them to become lessened, and they are becoming endangered for that reason, because we are involved with, all the things that negatively impact them. Many species are now threatened, and many of these species provide food, medicine, fibers, other important things that we rely on. And so when we kill them and they become extinct, we're going to lose out on a lot of those sources. We are currently, scientists at least believe, that we are currently in a mass extinction, where we are seeing organisms die every single day that probably shouldn't be dying, if not for us. And so we are causing another mass extinction. Right? It probably won't fully impact humanity for quite some time, but we're in the process of it. Okay. Biogeographical factors, everyone, is a little bit, I would say, unimportant, but since we're here, I'll just mention it, that location plays a role in diversity. Latitude, species are typically more diverse in the tropics, right? If you look at the Amazon rainforest, there's more organisms in the Amazon rainforest, I believe, than everywhere else on Earth combined. Very densely populated, and it just happens to be near the tropic, due to the near the poles. The warmer climates are going to be able to sustain more organisms. And larger areas are more diverse because they offer greater habitat diversity, right? There's more room for them to thrive. So these are two pretty, I don't want to say unimportant again, but two pretty obvious things, right? The bigger the area, the more species it could support. And the warmer the climate, the more organisms can live, right? So just keep in mind that location, right, does play a role in diversity. Okay. And the last slide, everybody, pathogens. This isn't a microbiome class. We don't really learn too much about them, but when we talk about diversity, it's important to talk about disease, and at least mention that pathogens are any organisms that cause disease, right? So it could be viruses, it could be bacteria, fungi, anything that causes illness. And they are a significant impactor on habitats, on ecosystems. And the less biodiverse an ecosystem is, everybody, the more effect it will have. If you are a ecosystem with low diversity, a disease is going to impact you more significantly. Okay? Congrats, guys. We're done. I wish I could have been there in person to finish up the content, but life happens, and unfortunately, again, I am not feeling too great, so that's all right. We finished. You guys did it. It has been a long year, but we are not done. We still have a lot of review to do before your exam in a couple of weeks, and we will do that. But we are officially done with all of the necessary content. Okay, if we do have some time, we may look at a few math problems just to get an idea of how they function, but we are done with the content. So great job, everybody. I hope to be back tomorrow, and if not, hopefully, certainly by Friday, we will begin review at that point. All right, everybody, if you have any questions, please feel free to email me. I will try and answer them as soon as possible. But otherwise, see you all very soon. Okay? Have a great rest of your day, guys.